I think it's 12:15, so I will start slowly, and if others will join, then it's too bad for them. Hello, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Søren Askegaard. I'm a professor at the Department of Marketing and Management at SDU, and I'm also recently nominated chair of the Danish Institute of Advanced Study, a position that I'm very proud of and humble about. And I've been invited to talk a little bit about my research here, so that the DS community and others can get to know me a little bit more. While thinking about what to do for a presentation of myself and my research, there was obviously a lot of possibilities. Other recent research projects that are very dear to me and that I would have liked to talk about are, for example, the emergence of new cuisines and taste regimes, together with my colleagues Danny Kjeldgaard and Eric Arnold, or inherent moralizations within consumer research on food and health, together with a Swiss, Italian, Russian colleague, Ksenia Silchenko, or experiences of the ambivalent nature of consumer empowerment in medical health services, together with wonderful colleague Anna Schneider-Kamp. But instead, I chose this research topic, which is more of a project than an act or a prospect than a project. As you will see, it's something that I am embarking on. And the reason for doing this is that it's something that I have since long been interested in, but not really worked much with. But more recently, I've become more interested in the anthropos of consumption, to speak very briefly. And I also think that I'm going to spend a good part of the rest of my career, I'm approaching 60 years of age, investigating and reading about, and maybe also writing about this anthropos of consumption. And I also thought of it as a very good example of what DS can be, or maybe should be about, at least seen from my perspective, since it's a highly cross-disciplinary project. Finally, it might be the fact that it's potentially career ruining, because it's both politically dangerous. Anything about society and biology seems to be very, very politically dangerous these days. And it's cross-disciplinary. But since maybe I don't have much of a career to ruin anyway, it doesn't really matter that much. You can also see it, the presentation, as a kind of suicide note. So let me continue with a situation of this idea of the anthropos of consumption, or a reflection and an answer, or a remediation of the question why consumers are not biological beings, by situating this in my past research. For about 30 years, I have worked at the Department of Marketing at SDU, former Odense University, now Department of Marketing and Management, as a scholar of consumer research, or sometimes, depending on the concept, research in consumer citizens. And obviously, over 30 years, I've been around a number of topics and a number of issues in my research. But to summarize very, very briefly, my claim to fame, if I have any, I guess that I could be qualified as somebody who's tried to promote the consumer citizen as an animal symbolicum, to recycle philosopher Anthony Cassir's old denominator. That is, looking at consumption not as utilitarian decisions, as is standard in much of consumer research in universities and business schools around the world, but as symbolic practices. And this is quite broadly speaking. Maybe more specifically, I have been interested in and written about the consumer citizen as a homo desiderans, or if you want to be Latin purist, homo desideratans, which was a project together with wonderful colleagues from Turkey and the United States, addressing what we could qualify as the embodied affective and social character of motivational forces within consumption practices, as they are distinct from needs and wants. Already here you can see that there is a little devotion for these sort of biological denominator, the animal symbolicum, the homo desiderans or desideratans. And of course, that's not coincidental. I hope that it will be clear why this is. So my fundamental inscription in a research context globally and locally is to contribute to bring consumer research beyond what could very roughly and also in a reductionist way, unfortunately, but the time does not allow for elaboration, consumer research beyond economic and psychological individualist reductionism. So it's basically a matter of investigating the nexus or the interrelationship between the individual, the consumer citizen as an agent, and the societal norms, structures, practices, etc., that are embedding the consumer citizen as an individual. However, inspired by one of my old great inspirational sources, Edgar Morin, who also happens to be a doctor honoris causa at SDU, and his book on the lost paradigm. He is not stopping at this structure agency, the individual society nexus, but also includes sorry, wrong way. I have a very sensitive mouse, so I'm sorry if some of the slides will jump. So he also introduces the triangular relationship between individual, society, and species. The subtitle for Le Paradigme Perdu, the lost paradigm, is the human nature, which is kind of an indication of where we are going. So Morin's target with this book from 1973 was to also to challenge what he might qualify as a biocentrist, or maybe with a more contemporary term, neo-Darwinist, as well as anthropocentrist reductionism. In other words, challenging anthropology as well as biology to overcome their myopia and be more inclusive and respectful for the insights generated in each of those disciplines. Being a sociologist by training, Morin spent a year at the Salk Institute of Biology in California, and was highly inspired by transdisciplinary reflections on the nexus of sociology and biology that he felt was inherent in the discussions, paradigmatic discussions going on at that time. And so I would like to also add this species in the triangular setting of the individual and the society, which has been the focal point of consumer research and of our consumer research within the what is called CCT, consumer culture theory, socio-anthropologically inspired approaches to consumption for the last 20, 30 years. As noted by Tim Ingold, a cultural anthropologist, this is no small task, and I'm very humbled by this. I have no dreams of being able to make a major contribution here. I'm just very curious about this triangular relationship, and since I have no career to destroy, as I said, I'm curious to embark or to participate in this, what Tim Ingold called an evolutionary equivalent to the general theory of relativity. So without putting too much stress on this exact analog, we speak here about a fairly fundamental paradigmatic challenge or paradigmatic revolution. From both, at least seen from anthropology and consumer research. Because the short point of departure for this curiosity is that basically my field of research, which is consumer culture theory, is the common denominator, demonstrates a complete abjuration of most anything biological. And this is for maybe good and obvious historical reasons. There's a lot of examples of bad biosocial contextual or connection of biological and social theorizing in the history, from eugenics to various racist theorization. In a little less, but still provocative sense, we can think of the so-called sociobiology wars, the introduction of sociobiology from the 1970s onwards, and its consequent mythologization of socially constructed phenomena, as discussed and deconstructed, for example, in terms of gender by Fausto Sterling, a biologist deconstructing sociobiology, the sociobiology of gender. Or more recently, evolutionary psychology and its essentialist search for a universal human nature. And here I would like to quote a scholar that I recently came across, namely David Buller, who is an exceptional evolutionary psychologist who claims that a lot of, in fact, the most well-known and the most widespread examples of the knowledge of evolutionary psychology is plain wrong from as well a biological as a psychological perspective. So I suppose you could call Buller a critical evolutionary psychologist. Nevertheless, there is no shortage these days of the presence of evolutionary psychology within consumer research. For example, the study mentioned here by Durante and her colleagues on ovulation, female competition, and product choice, hormonal influences on consumer behavior. And actually, my renewed interest in this triangle, the triangle of Edgar Morin between species, individual, and society, came out of overhearing a conversation between some of my most well-esteemed colleagues within consumer culture theory talking about this paper, and sort of rejecting outright not just the reductionist approach, which is inherent in the research project that Durante and her colleagues are presenting from an anthropological or socio-anthropological perspective, but an outright rejection of the whole idea that hormonal factors could have any impact whatsoever on consumer behavior beyond the obvious and banal. And when overhearing this conversation, I was sort of struck by this violent abjuration and this complete lack of acceptance that after all, we are biological beings. And so when you look at consumer culture theory, there's no shortage of theorizing embodiment, but there is, paradoxically speaking, very little body, at least seen from a biological or even a biosocial perspective within consumer culture theory. So I guess the short version of the story is my contribution here is to try to make a small step towards remedying this complete absence of our biological existence as human beings or human becomings, as Tim Golden calls us. I'll come back to that a little later in consumer culture theory. In other words, avoiding to throw the baby out with the ovulation. Make a fun pun, but of course making fun in Zoom meetings is probably not in the best context. As Nicolas Rose, great Foucauldian scholar of governmentality and biopolitics from London School of Economics, underlines, culture mediates everything, but so does our existence as physical and biological beings. Reductionist evolutionism is an insult to Darwin, but abjuration of our biology altogether is an insult to existence. Luckily, we live in an age of genomics and epigenomics where the old tropes of biological and genetic determinisms can no longer be scientifically supported. So Rose, in his 2013 piece, sort of argues why humanist and social sciences, particularly social sciences, should not be oblivious to recent developments within the discipline of biology that sort of opens up for a more fertile or a more mutually respectful and non-reductionist cross-fertilization of these domains. So this is obviously also where I, when I read this, where I went back to my old master from my period of undergrad studies and graduate studies, Edgar Morin, and his complexity paradigm and his principles for an epistemology beyond reductionism and determinism. Not he establishes 7 principles as guiding for such a paradigm of complexity that he, for those of you who are not familiar with Morin, then applies in a series of volumes on physics, biology, knowledge, ideologies or ideascapes, you could call it, and humanity and ethics, in order to establish a non-reductionist epistemology of the modern sciences, and including a volume as well on biology, in which he unfolds the paradigm of complexity on the insights that he gathered at the Salk Institute in California. And I will not go through these 7 principles easily and much more. Just spend on one of the principles, the principle of autonomy and dependence, in order to unpack Morin's understanding of the living being, not just the human being, but of any living being. So from Morin's perspective, all living entities are what you could qualify as self-organizing systems that are constantly self-reproducing, right? So these beings are, again, with the notion used by Tim Ingold and Gisli Paulson, not really human beings, but human becomings. So the interesting thing about this self-organizing system is that it at the same time demonstrates a fundamental autonomy and a fundamental dependence. And this is one of Maussian's key ideas, is the uniduality of complex relationships, the mutually constitutive and mutually exclusive character of phenomena in a complex dialogical relationship. So, for example, the relationship between autonomy and dependence is complex. It's antagonistic, but it's also mutually constitutive, in the sense that the self-reproduction of the organism requires energy to retain the autonomy that it has constructed as a living entity. Given this requirement, the organism is therefore dependent on the energy of the environment. So this is a very sort of simple example of the way in which Maussian constructs the complex antagonistic and mutually constituent processes of his unidual, or the uniduality of his conceptual worlds. So from Maussian's perspective, all living beings constitute an auto-echo-geno-pheno reorganization, an autonomous entity that has a dependency relation both with its environment, eco, as well as with its genomic and phenotypical constitution, which is constantly reorganized through the encounter with the environment, and through the regeneration of itself, given its genophenotypical constitution. Right? Thus, Maussian is also forced to conclude that the distinction between nature and culture is untenable. In very short, if you consider the Homo sapiens, or Homo demens, as he also prefers to call us, but that's a different story. If you consider the Homo sapiens, there is nothing unnatural about human culture, and there is nothing uncultural about human nature. So this is a fundamental, his work represents a fundamental dissolution of the nature-culture distinction. In that respect, of course, he is aligned with a number of other central actors that have since addressed similar issues, notably the wonderful book by Philippe Descola, Beyond Nature and Culture, where he investigates human ontologies beyond anthropocentrism, but also a recent discovery of mine, Tim Ingold and Gisli Paulsen's book on biosocial becomings, where they try to integrate biological and cultural anthropology. And finally, from the more biological side, not from the anthropological side, for example, the work of the recently deceased Jesper Hoffmeyer on biosemiotics, where he theorizes semiosis, that is information and meaning making and communication, as the foundational principle of life. Of course, there are lots of other sources that I am currently discovering or rediscovering concerning this rethinking of the nature-culture relationship, including Gregory Bateson, David Buller, that I already mentioned, Donna Haraway, Jeffrey Hodgson, Eduardo Kuhn, Bruno Latour, Gilles Lipovetsky, Joël de Rosnay, maybe others. So if you have suggestions, I will be very open to that afterwards. So this was kind of the the framing of what I'm going to spend a couple of years or more, if God or whichever principle that are guiding our lives will. But I would like to conclude with a small test example, because I do have a couple of projects that are sort of offspring of this interest in rethinking consumption in a biosocial context. And this example is one that I'm currently conducting in collaboration with wonderful colleagues from Aarhus University, Paul Chrysokou, who is a cognitive psychologist, and Ankur Kapoor, who's a consumer researcher from India. And it addresses the practice of eating with your hands, inspired by also our former colleague here at SDU, Ole G. Maussian, and his work on the physiological construction of tastes and taste experiences. The practice, the project on the practice of eating with your hands addresses not so much the experiences coming from the mouth, which is one big element in the human brain concerning the homunculus, in other words, the sort of relative importance of various bodily impressions in the brain, but another important part of the body, the hands. So inspired by Maussian and his work on the mouth feeling, for example, we were considering whether the hand feeling of the practice of eating would not be one particular example of such a biocultural approach to consumption. So the general research problem that we are addressing, it's not really an exact research question yet. It's exploratory in the deepest sense of the word. Because there is no anthropology currently of eating with the hands. We have been able to locate one article. So the research problem that we are trying to address is, what can the practice of eating with the hands tell us about the human being as a biocultural entity or biocultural being? This we would like to do. We are developing it in dialogue with, among other people, Ulrike Maussian. Also, I'm entering into contact with a London-based chef, Joseph Youssef, who's a founder of the Kitchen Theory Project, and also collaborating with a tactile researcher, Charles Spence from Oxford University. So I'll come back to that in a little while. The analytical framing of this project. There are several possible. One that I've been thinking of lately, and it's really lately because it's the last few days while preparing this talk, is recycling my friend and colleague Douglas Holts' typology of consumption practices for a more biosocial context of eating with your hands. Douglas Holt, in a seminal 1995 paper, distinguishes between structures of action, and here between person-object consumption actions and interpersonal consumption actions on the one hand, and the purpose of consumption actions on the other hand, where he distinguishes between autotelic and instrumental consumption actions. And so he comes up with this fourfold model of consumption as experience, autotelic person-object actions, consumption as integration, instrumental person-object actions, consumption as play, autotelic interpersonal actions, and consumption as classification, instrumental interpersonal actions. And if we are reinterpreting this framework in a biosocial eating with your hands context, it might look something like this. For example, an autotelic person-object action would be investigating, and this is of course the point of departure for our interest here, the sort of the hand feeling, not the mouth feeling as theorized and investigated by Maussian, but the hand feeling of the food and the ideas conveyed to you as a consumer through the tactile investigation, the tactile contact with the food. The more instrumental aspect of that hand feeling would be sort of enlarging or extrapolating the hand feeling to the setting of the triangular, the hand, the food, and the me, the prospect and the process of incorporation of the food, that this is about to be part of me and it's about to become ingested and digested by my body. So from this perspective, we would investigate the importance or the significance of the incorporation process through the eating with the hand practice. In terms of the interpersonal action, other than hand feeding others, which is not currently an element of what we are investigating, we would address, for example, the importance of proxemics and community building through the process of eating with the hands. Notably, for example, the practice known from certain cultures of sharing from a large tray food that you dive into with pieces of bread or small lumps of rice, and you dip it in various sauces. So the proxemic and the community aspects of these practices, and the embodiment of the proxemic and communitarian aspects. And finally, from the instrumental perspective, how eating with your hands is embedded in codified social norms and rules. Eating with the right hand, not the left one. Eating the right foods with the hand, not the foods that you should not touch with your hands in certain cultures, etc., etc. So the embeddedness of the practice of the eating with the hands and the sort of incorporation of the feeling of violating such norms, if you do that, the feeling of sickness or nausea from accidentally touching your food with the hand that is considered dirty, etc., is something that would be qualified as instrumental interpersonal practice of eating with your hands. And it's obvious that these processes are highly culturally coded. We have unfortunately not much results because the data collection was ongoing when Corona brought a halt to everything going on in public life, in particular in India, where the first round of data collection is taking place. But we have these preliminary results from our pilot study, a survey conducted in India and the United States among a good 800 respondents, 400 approximately from each culture. And first of all, these results indicate obviously the cultural embeddedness of the practice of eating with your hands, which these results indicate eating with your hands at home, but of course they can be further qualified by going out and eating, which may have, we haven't had a chance to look at the results yet, all the results may have an impact, for example, on the prevalence of fast food chains in the United States. But it's also interesting to see, and maybe we'll have to do a follow-up study, of course, how the Corona crisis can fundamentally actually, in order not to, if not to, will fundamentally, at least on a short-term basis, alter the practices of eating with your hands or touching food with your hands, and the cultural differences that might be embedded in these. Also, here we have some further results from the pilot study concerning how consumers evaluate the practice of eating with your hands in the United States and India, respectively. And as you can see, and the three of the results are significant. Indians significantly more than Americans think that eating with your hands makes the food taste better, makes eating more enjoyable, and is something that that is tied to feeling comfortable. the other significant results, two other, if I remember correctly, but I don't have the statistics here. Paul, my wonderful colleague, has them. Eating with your hand is significantly less socially acceptable in the United States, and also statistically less considered less hygienic. And again, these results, of course, are pre-coronavirus, and so that should, of course, be taken into consideration. So right now we're conducting further anthropological investigations, first in India, which is a culture with a deeply embedded eating with your hands practice, which we thought to investigate using the theory from biocultural anthropology. I've mentioned some of these people theorizing the practice of eating with your hands from a non-anthropocentric perspective, but also applying some of the work of, for example, Alberto Gallas, Charles Spence, and Ole G. Maussian, and investigating these practices through a biotactile analysis, trying to see if we can come up with ideas about cross-modal perception. For example, what changes in the eating with the hand practice if you have a visual clue or if you are blinded, one of the potential modes of analysis that we are going to investigate. But as I said, data collection is ongoing, so I can't really tell you anything more specific about this analysis. So also, I don't really have something to conclude, and this talk has been long enough. I was hoping for 30 minutes. I see that I can't exactly do that, but I can at least go to the second last slide, which is not really a conclusion, but rather a reflection on why investigate eating with your hands as a biosocial practice. And of course, since we are at SDU, we might try to answer that question in terms of the United Nations Strategic Development Goals. And here we might say that there are at least two reasons why we should consider the biosocial practice of eating with your hands. First, because an investigation of the bioanthropological practice of eating with the hands may inform us about certain consequences for human health, which is one, of course, of the strategic development goals. This is the interest that is predominant with my wonderful colleague Paul from Aarhus, who's interested in the relationship between eating with your hands and good versus less good foods, a distinction that I'm a little bit skeptical about myself, but I will let Paul handle his own research interests and then whip in that respect. From my perspective, why I think this is interesting is because, back to the research problem, what can investigating the practice of eating with your hands tell us about the human being as a biocultural entity? Because I hope and I think that it can assist in reconceptualizing the anthropos beyond an anthropocentric view, putting the human being or the human becoming back into a role of a part of this world, a part of its ecosystem, a part of life in general, and not something that is outside nature. So a part of nature, not something that should be juxtaposed with nature. And I think that such a mode of thinking might be very useful, maybe even conditional for addressing issues concerning global sustainability in the Anthropocene period. So yeah, on these not so small notes, I would like to end my presentation. Thank you for staying with me, although some presentations are less than compelling, but I hope that I have succeeded in portraying a little bit of what I'm interested in and what I hope to do with my presence in the DS office, and a little bit also on my background and my research career. So thank you for your attentions, and if there are any questions, I will be happy to answer those.
Hi, Søren. This is Christine Ben. I'm taking the word since I can't see.
Yes. Okay.
And thank you for the presentation, which was really nice and interesting. And welcome to DS.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for doing this, Mai. Thank you.
Can I ask you a question? Oh, sorry.
Christine.
I have changed my mic now. Is that better?
Much better.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so yeah, thank you for the presentation. The question I wanted to ask is, I work with the immune system and sex differences in the immune system, and they are here, there, and everywhere in the immune system, in the diseases we get, the way we respond to vaccines, and so on. So for me, it's not such a long stretch, and perhaps not surprising if biology of the sex in terms of biology also has profound effects on our behavior and our consumerism, etc. And I saw that you had several references to hormones, to there was another with sexual connotations thing, ovulation, I think. But I was just wondering whether every time I talk about the biology of sex also in behavior, I get almost killed by my female peers who say you're ruining everything we have fought for so long. This you know, gender is a social construct. It's nothing about biology, and it sounded a little bit like you face some of the same challenges. And I'm just wondering whether you also see that this gender debate and Me Too perhaps and so on. Not that I'm not at all. I'm very supportive of Me Too and so on, but it's at the same time, we are having now a censored debate about the role of biology and the biology of the sexes.
Thank you, Christine. And this is you know, the issue of vaccination is of course not just big in your field, but also a big thing in the studying consumption and consumer choices, anti-vaccine movements, etc., etc. I can completely recognize your sort of your position. That's why I said that maybe it's a suicide note that
Yes.
that I'm, and again, this has for me absolutely nothing to do with Me Too or like or similar sort of social movements for you know, social construction of gender relations, etc., etc., and everything to do with the fact that that we are 100% cultural, yes, all the time, but we are also 100% biological all the time, and we cannot reduce one and the other. So I'd also be interested in knowing more, to the extent that I can read what you write. Or we can talk about the differences in terms of vaccination, because that's obviously another example that I can bring into the consumer culture theorization domain in order to sort of you know, support a non-reductionist view on the importance of gender in consumption patterns.
That would be interesting to discuss, and also how we avoid that we end in that trap that we can't discuss the biology.
Absolutely. I mean, I've recently been reading, because I was interested in the sort of classical critique of social biology. So I read Myths of Gender by Anne Fausto Sterling, which is kind of a biological refusal of the socio-biological reductionisms, but of course, as a biologist, she does not refuse that there is something called gender, least it's a difficult position to
Mm.
so I'm but she is obviously a feminist and I also think a lesbian activist. So I think in this debate there are this is a highly politicized debate where you enter a full spectrum of positions that you will sort of have to navigate. But I look forward to discussing these things with you very much.
Me too. Thank you.
Keith, you have
Sorry.
asked a question.
Yes. I was wondering, have you thought about like the preconditions necessary for the emergence of cultural practices? Because I'm thinking about in the economics and development literature, there's been this focus on how cultures and practices develop as a result of the introduction of technology or the availability of specific types of resources, or if you talk about Jared Diamond, types of crops and how that leads to different types of cultural practices. There's a work by Nathan Nunn on how the plow and the adoption of the plow determines gender roles in various different types of cultures. I know someone else who's doing something in China with the availability of cotton and weaving technology. And so I was wondering about that, because in a lot of ways, it's when I'm listening to what you're saying, you're treating culture as given, and you're comparing disparate groups, Americans and Indians, I see, but culture is an endogenous thing. It evolves from a lot of factors that we might say, oh, we could treat as given. And I was wondering, because that might actually give us some sort of like wedges to compare different groups based off of, within India, for example, it's a very heterogeneous subcontinent with many different cultures. Yeah. And so, depending on what type of crops are available or suitable for the region, you have different types of foods get adopted, and that evolves into different types of, practices. And that might affect the propensity for people to use their hands versus utensils to consume their foodstuffs. And that evolves over time. Just was wondering if you've been considering these preconditions.
Thank you, Keith. I'll also look you up and talk more about these examples. These are not familiar to me. For example, the plow, etc. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about that. First, I would like to say that if I gave the impression that I take culture as something given, then that's either I have not been clear enough, or I mean, because that's completely in opposition to what I believe. Culture is always in becoming, right? Just like the individual is in becoming. So phenomena like emergence are very, very central also to the thoughts that I have about these processes. Some of the relationships that you are alluding to are treated, for example, in the domain of STS literature, science, technology, and society literature. So yes, I'm familiar with that, but I am, as I said, I'm just embarking on this, and I haven't yet sort of beyond Bruno Latour, which is of course a key figure here. I haven't yet sort of thrown STS into the picture, but your comment is well taken, and I would like to talk more about some of the examples that you bring to the table. So thank you for that. Yeah. So I am observant of these preconditions or the phenomenon of emergence, but I'm not. I haven't sort of constructed a more elaborate relationship between, for example, the STS literature and what I'm trying to say. But this is something that, as I said, this is for 3, 4, 5-year project, so there's time.
All right. Yeah. A bee just flew into my room, so if I've been looking around,
Yeah.
I'm gonna go open the window. But yeah, the way you were presenting the data and statistics in the study, that's what made me kind of think about that.
Yeah.
And so in economics, we tend to be very harsh about that.
This is super preliminary pilot, just to investigate in a non-representative sample. Also because both in India and the US, representing the population of such a size and heterogeneity is a very tricky issue, right? So it was just a matter of a very sort of a rough portrayal of this practice. It's not, there's absolutely nothing conclusive. But since these were the only results that I have currently, I wanted to share.
So if you want a demographically representative sample of the United States in terms of like food and like consumption and things like that, all the consumer research that's done on, and market research with like restaurants and food is done in Columbus, Ohio, pretty much. I know this because I have colleagues that have worked in consumer research and in firms. So if you, I mean, they're demographically, it's a representative of the United States as a whole, based off of its characteristics. But that's just the thing. If I was going to be focusing on like a specific geographic area and I wanted to construct a representative sample, I would consider that. But
yeah, well, I'd like to go back to Columbus, Ohio. It's actually the twin city of Odense, and I went there for a conference in the year 1999, or some 20 years ago. It was an absolutely boring city, but it did have a very un-American feature. It had a porn shop on the main street, which was kind of very un-American. This is the only thing I can remember.
Well, there's a lot. Columbus has changed a lot over the number of past 20 years.
Hopefully for the better. It was quite dull when I was there.
Ohio's dull in general, but okay.
sorry. I don't know. Maybe you're from Columbus. I didn't know.
I know. I'm from Ohio, so I know everything about it. All right.
Can I make a comment? I don't know. Is it possible?
Danny, you just.
Okay, so it was just follow up on Keith. I suppose the meringue perspective you take, Søren, would I guess say that there is not a precondition for culture. I mean, the plow did not emerge, fall from the sky. It is also so it must be the co-constitutive relationship between the artifacts and the culture and the biology and so on.
Absolutely, yes. So again, because it's this approach kind of denies linear causalities, right? So you're absolutely right. Yeah, thank you for the clarification. It's good to get that pointed out.
I'm not sure if there's any further questions, or you could raise a hand or write in the chat function.
I have a question.
Yes, Pantelis?
Yes, thanks for the talk, Søren. That was very interesting. So my question is there a room for formalism in your work? So in your presentation, you presented your stream of research as a reaction to the individualism that is dominant in economics and psychology. And you talked about emergence and the social aspect. And those concepts have been also formalized, and there have been formal tools that have been applied to demonstrate these ideas. And I was wondering to what extent there is a room for mathematics or a formal computational approach, computational social science approach in what you are doing. Is there room for such tools to be used? And also in respect to anthropology, following up on a comment by Keith, for instance, there is a branch of anthropology that is very formal and that studies cultural evolution. So there are people like Joe Henry.
Yeah. No, absolutely, there's space for formalism. I think of the kind of the paradigmatic challenge is not one of methodology. There are lots of things that can be mathematized and formalized. I think the problem is what is the scope of insight and conclusion that you can draw from the formalization? Because the formalization, of course, also generates a certain exclusion of phenomena, or an exclusion of dimensions. So I'm not a uni-methodological researcher myself, but I'm quite wary of the types of conclusions that can be drawn from different methodologies, right? So absolutely, let's formalize what can be formalized, but let's also be conscious about the limitations that any type of formal reduction, because the formalization is obviously a reduction, will generate.
Yes. I don't know if there's any further questions. Something you would like to add?
We don't have tidbits and whatever as usual, but you're free. Feel free to go to the kitchen and.
Do you have anything to add, Søren?
No, just thank you for the comments and you know, Pantelis, we will talk more. Keith, I will also, and Christina, I would like to follow up on the points made. And so thank you for the comments, and thank you for staying with me for so long on Zoom. Every hour is like a day, or 10 minutes is like a whole day. So thank you for your stamina, and hope to see you on campus soon in the DS building or elsewhere.
I can see that you have an applause. So.
Thank you.
Great, and we would like to thank from DS for you to participate and having this lecture, Søren. It's always nice, and thank you for everyone to stay and ask great questions. And we continue the following Wednesdays with further lectures, and you can see who and what on our website, and we will send out emails for you at DS if you haven't got any yet. So
thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye.